Wish I'd have gotten a haircut now.
Well, I felt a lot of pressure today knowing how handsome you are.
Oh, you make me laugh. That's funny.
All right. Well,
I think there are only two people in the world that think I'm handsome, Donna and me. It only takes two.
You haven't counted them all. That's the thing. So,
maybe that's it.
hey, welcome if you've just joined us. We're a couple of minutes away from our April webinar, Conversational Coaching That Makes a Meaningful Difference. Bob Sanders and I were just engaging in some witty banter leading up to.
Well, it was banter. Witty, I don't know. It was banter.
So we will start in just about 2 minutes. While you get settled in, you'll note that there is a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. So if you have questions at any time or you want to make a comment, please enter those there. And we will start in just 1 minute. Our April webinar, Conversational Coaching That Makes a Meaningful Difference. While we wait, also want to just remind you that it is being recorded today. And we have a special offer at the end of today's webinar for everyone that's attending. So thank you very much for that. And again, if you have questions, if you just joined us, if you have questions or things you want to add to the conversation, use that Q&A button at the bottom. And my colleague and our moderator today, Cole Schnitzer, he is our head of customer success here at TalkMeUp. He'll be watching that and making sure that we're aware of your questions. We're going to answer them as we go. And we'll start in just a couple minutes.
Andy, you've got quite the radio voice, by the way. It's almost like you've been an announcer before.
Yeah, you'd think. I have a face for radio.
Yeah, that's funny.
So should just be the narrator. Okay, so I have the top of the hour for us to start. So why don't we start right on time, Bob? How about that?
I think that sounds great.
To honor those that have joined us, I want to thank everyone for joining us very much. In our April webinar, we have a very special guest today. His name is Bob Sanders. I'll introduce him here in just a moment. But Bob is going to speak with us about conversational coaching. And we've used that term conversational quite intentionally. Coaching should be a conversation, not an event. And Bob will build on that in just a moment. But it's not just chit chat. It should have a meaningful impact. And we'll get into that as well. My name is Andy Smith. I'm the Vice President of Sales and Marketing for TalkMeUp. I'm joined by my colleague, Cole Schnitzer. Cole is our head of customer success. He's going to be our moderator today. And if you have questions or comments that you want to make and add to our discussion, use that Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and we'll be sure to answer those. We're going to try to answer them in the moment, but if we don't get to them right away, I promise you we'll get to them by the end of our webinar today. So our conversation with Bob Sanders. And so let's make more of a formal introduction for you, Bob.
I thought you said special guest. There was somebody else coming. That's me.
That's you. That's
okay.
Right.
Well, then let's go ahead and do it. Then hopefully I wrote something really good for you to say. Really flowery.
I'm trying to give you time to be special, so at least think of how you might. So Bob, okay. Bob is a true coaching guru, and I'll mention that in a moment. But right now he's the CEO of Axiom Sales Kinetics. Has over 30 years of experience. Teaching leaders at AT&T, Verizon, Thrive, CommScope, and many, many more on how to become a genuine high-performing coach. He's got an interesting opinion about what coaching is and what it's not, but I will say from my own personal experience, Bob and I worked together in the past, and in my 30-plus years of leading sales organizations and trying to put teams in the position to perform, and also with our clients, I've yet to come across anyone that's better at coaching than Bob, and I truly mean that. And so, Bob, I hope you didn't hear that, because
I was totally in the zone. I wasn't listening to anything you were saying.
Right, I'm serious though. I think Bob really gets what coaching is and what it's not. And so as we get to that, let me just move into and let's talk really quickly about who is TalkMeUp for our first time guests. So TalkMeUp has a AI-powered communication effectiveness coaching, practice, and feedback tool. It's a platform for leaders of the modern workforce, and we'll share that with you in a moment. We're not here necessarily to talk about TalkMeUp, but TalkMeUp does help you become more conversational and much more persuasive which is so important in any kind of conversation, but certainly as a coach. So we'll get into more about TalkMeUp in just a moment. But let's, Bob, you have a very interesting, when I asked you about this, you had a very interesting perspective about what coaching is and what it's not. So let's move into that right now, if you don't mind.
Sure.
And pose the question, if you will. When there's a gap or a guiding principle, right, that you shared with me, which I thought was really interesting, is that, you know, if there's a gap between someone's expected performance and their actual results, to not confuse coaching with feedback. And I think all my life I've been taught before you that feedback was a part of coaching, but you think it's actually two very different things. Why is that?
Yeah, and I think, and by the way, they're both useful. So this isn't a value judgment where I'm going to say, well, feedback's bad, coaching is good. It's not like that. It's that they're useful, but often misapplied conversations. So maybe the best way to explain it is if we go to the next slide, Cole, and walk through sort of this visual representation, this pyramid that represents how results are actually produced. And it gives us a really easy way to visualize the difference between feedback and coaching. And so on this pyramid, you see the top is the results. And what's important for us to all understand is results are the output, the byproduct of the behavior that we engage in, right? It's how we execute the things that we're supposed to do, whatever that job is. So in selling, that's how well we prospect, how well we qualify, how well we present, handle objections and negotiations. In engineering, it might be how well we define requirements, how well we plan the work. So things like that, right? But those behaviors are enabled by the skill and knowledge that we develop over time. And that ultimately depends on our commitment to developing the skill and knowledge and our capacity to do it. So for example, I mean, it's a commonly used example. I will never be the starting center for the Dallas Mavericks. Doesn't matter how hard I'm working. I'm not tall enough and I can't change that. I guess I could try one of those surgeries where you extend your legs, but it's probably not worth it because I can't extend it by like 2 feet. So we are limited in our ability to develop the skill and knowledge that allows us to execute the behaviors to produce the results by our innate talents, right? And so when we talk about feedback, feedback is the conversation where we identify a gap in the results, or in some cases, the behaviors that we're looking to see somebody execute, and we tell the person that we see this gap. So for example, in a sales environment, if somebody is missing their number, I say, hey, you didn't make your number. Now, that's not very good feedback, by the way, because usually people know that. It gets to be better feedback if I say, you didn't make your number, and it's really because we're not hitting the pipeline targets that we need. It's better, still feedback, right? It's even feedback if I say, and you're not hitting the pipeline targets because when you're trying to get appointments, you're not making a compelling case for someone to want to meet with you. That's behavioral feedback, but it's still feedback. The difference between that and coaching is feedback focuses on the behavior of the results. Coaching is based on the recognition that the person may not have the skill or knowledge necessary to execute them. So how you know the difference between what you should do in a given scenario is feedback is fine if the person has the skill and knowledge necessary to go execute. So feedback's really good, for example, where priorities get confused. Or maybe there was a pattern recognition that I hadn't quite gotten yet, but now that you explained it to me, I get it right away and I can go do it. In other words, if I'm going to give you feedback and you have the skill and knowledge to take that feedback and execute differently and produce a different result, then feedback is all that was necessary.
Okay.
But if you don't, that's a problem.
So Bob, you know, the sports examples, of course, are front and center, and it could be sports, it could be any kind of performance. So if I'm a leader and I've got a team of professionals that are trying to work on a project to get out the door, like new product updates, whatever it might be, or if I'm leading. So why do coaches, I mean, they confuse feedback with coaching. They think they're coaching, but they're just giving feedback. And so why is that?
I think there are a couple of reasons. I think one is they're pressed for time, and coaching conversations are not easy. They require a certain diagnostic conversation to happen. And then as the coach, if I've uncovered a gap, I've identified the root cause, I need to be able to give somebody something to do, a drill, an exercise, an activity that's going to shrink that gap. So think golf lessons, a good example. If the instructor identifies that you're hooking the ball all the time, you know that you're hooking the ball too. But if they figure out why, they don't really bring you value unless they can tell you what to do to fix it, right? And so managers oftentimes are too pressed for time, or they feel too pressed for time to engage in that level of depth to really identify the root cause. Sometimes they won't do it because they don't know what to do to fix it. There's no library of assignments. PGA Tour or PGA coaching professionals, they actually have libraries. In fact, I was just checking this out before the call, Andy. Soccer coaches can go to this website where there's an entire library of drills that you can use to help reskill or upskill your players. So in a lot of jobs, that just doesn't exist. And so it's hard for a manager to say, okay, well, I'm going to get into what the skill gap is or the knowledge gap, because they don't know what they'll do to fix it if they find it. So they really just want to encourage people to figure it out.
Okay. So to look at the model here, feedback then would be pointing out that the results weren't up to expectations, and similar to maybe somebody.
Or behavior. Could be behavior too.
Okay, well,
it's the first two levels.
Also behaviors, but that's still feedback then.
Yeah, that's still feedback.
So are you saying we get into coaching when we get into the underlying root cause of the behaviors?
Exactly.
But even still, feedback just pointing out you're lacking, you don't hold your mouth right.
Yes.
Is that coaching or is that feedback?
That's feedback. And if you have the skill to change the way you hold your mouth and the capacity and commitment to doing that, then that's all I needed to give you. You just didn't realize you were doing it. Right. I had this happen to me when I first started doing public speaking and training. My former business partner actually said to me, you have a filler word. You say all right all the time. And I didn't know I was doing it. And as soon as he made me aware, I was actually able, in that case, I had the skill to self-correct there. So that was really useful feedback for me. I didn't know I was doing it, right? That was a behavior feedback conversation. It wasn't about the result, because the result was okay, but the behavior still could be improved.
Okay. So I think in terms of the conversation, if we're talking about making it meaningful for people and having a good coaching conversation, to come back to your point, it's important not to confuse feedback with coaching, because it maybe takes on a different intent and mindset if you're coaching versus just, you're not saying one is better or more important than the other.
No, I absolutely not.
Okay.
What is important though is that we understand which is appropriate for the situation that we're in. If we're in a situation where the result that we are getting or the behavior that we're observing is something that we believe the person has the skill to correct, then giving them the feedback is useful to them, right? Like it was for me when Bob Nichols gave me the feedback about my filler word. If, on the other hand, they don't have the skill, then we need to engage in a deeper conversation where we diagnose what that skill or knowledge gap is and be prepared to help them. And I'm going to distinguish that kind of help here for a minute, because there are coaching models where we identify a gap in someone's performance, and then we enlist them in helping to brainstorm what can be done to address that gap. And I don't want to be too critical, but that is unfair to somebody who doesn't know, who doesn't have the skill or knowledge. It would be like taking a golf lesson, you and the instructor realizing that, not that you would do this, Andy, but that you're hooking the ball, and the golf instructor saying to you, what do you think you ought to do to fix that? Well, if you knew that, you wouldn't be paying for the lesson. And sometimes that's the kind of reaction we probably should get as managers when we tell people, yeah, I need to stop doing that. Sometimes they should look at us and go, yeah, I know. If I knew how to stop it, or I knew how to start doing it, or I knew how to do it differently, I wouldn't really need you. So, so it's important to understand when coaching is necessary. And by the way, If it's not necessary, it's really inefficient, and it can feel like it's sort of overburdening both the manager and the person if we're trying to figure out a skill gap that isn't there.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's take a look then. Of course, our expertise at TalkMeUp is around the conversational skills, but
Sure.
conversational coaching is of course our topic, but it should be a conversation, and there
Yes.
are some important things to consider. We'll kind of move ahead now and talk about the conversational aspect of this. So, what do you feel like are the underlying conversation skills that truly make coaching meaningful? And by meaningful, I guess let's start with what is meaningful coaching, and then we'll come back to the conversational skills.
Yeah, so it's meaningful coaching conversation if the person who is being coached knows what they need to do in order to shrink the skill or knowledge gap. They have clear understanding of what needs to be done, right? It's not if we leave them understanding that there's a gap and not knowing what to do about it. That's not really helpful, right? From a conversational perspective, I think that there are certain things that are essential for us that are sort of not the technical skills of figuring out what the gap is, right? Or knowing what the activity or assignment should be to shrink the gap. But there are conversational skills that are really essential for an effective coaching conversation. And I think like what you've got circled on the slide, the very first one is empathy.
Mm-hmm.
Coaches, and there's a great quote by Pat Summitt, the late great Pat Summitt of Tennessee basketball, who said, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. You cannot have a really strong, effective coaching conversation with someone who doesn't believe you care about them.
Mm.
They can't listen and you can't communicate effectively without that. And that requires that you have a certain empathy that you can apply more broadly, but it also really requires that you've spent some energy building relationship prior to this, that you also don't view it. I love the sentiment, the sentiment on here. If you think the coaching conversation is painful, then it's probably going to be painful if you're the coach, right? And it shouldn't be. I love that. I have my own personal coach, by the way. He's not really my personal coach. He's personal coach like 1 million Peloton users, but it's Matt Wilpers, who's an absolute stud. So here's my commercial for Matt. Matt has a saying I heard the other day: don't try don't worry about perfection. You can't do that, but you can always get better. One of the challenges we have as coaches is we get this mindset that a gap is a bad thing.
Yeah.
And it isn't. A difference between where someone wants to be and where they are, well, that's probably always going to happen. In fact, identifying that there's an opportunity to improve is a great thing. That means that we can get better, and that's good for the person being coached and the person providing the coaching. But if we go into that thinking, oh, these conversations are so painful, I have to tell this person that there's a gap. No, you have the opportunity to show them where they can get better. That's not a bad thing. That is actually a good thing. And if we go into those conversations and we make them feel painful, then people are going to avoid those conversations with us, and we can't get good at it.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
Love that.
Yeah, I love that too. You've referenced a couple of times. So let's move ahead and I want you to put your coaching hat to coach the coach. And because we've asked you about these skills, and you mentioned some that I've circled here that would be really important for a coach to have to make it meaningful. And
yeah,
empathy is that mindset on the both sides, that they get that you are really understanding their situation, that they're the focus of this, and the intent of this is about improving the performance of both. It's not corrective action. It's not punitive. Even if there is a gap, like you said, I love what the Peloton instructor said. And I don't care if there are 1 million guys on that Peloton call. He's talking to you, Bob. Let's face it.
I'm pretty sure that's true. I feel that.
Yeah, but isn't that cool? Like, right, Matt has an ability to relate to what you're doing, and he's not, as a coach, unaware of the challenge that there is in place. That it's hard. It's supposed to be hard. If it wasn't hard, it wouldn't be worth it.
Right.
And there's another really cool quote about coaching from many people that talk about, and they even talk about this in the military, to embrace the hard. They say it in maybe a more colorful way, but
Yes, I'm sure.
that's a good mindset. So when you think about someone that's coaching and you're thinking about making it conversational, right? So what I'm sharing here is a screenshot from a TalkMeUp recorded conversation. Myself and JJ Shu, our CEO, having a conversation. And it was a bit of a coaching conversation and a bit
She looks
not.
like she's hitting you.
She's virtually throwing a marble at me.
Okay.
So JJ and I are having this discussion. So if you look at this, Bob, and let's say I'm the coach and JJ is the person I'm coaching. My empathy at a 57. So you've talked about why empathy is important. What happens if it's not there? What if I'm trying to have a meaningful conversation and coach somebody around the root cause of a skill or a knowledge gap? What if I don't have empathy?
Yeah. And if you don't have empathy, the challenge that we'll find is that you won't be effective when it comes time to actually prescribe some activity, because, and even in the conversation, the person who you're speaking with can't listen effectively because they don't have a high enough level of trust. So what happens is there are two approaches we can take when we're listening. We can listen to understand, or we can listen to respond. If we're listening to understand, then we can actually get something out of it. If we're listening to respond, then it becomes extraordinarily difficult to actually hear what the other person is saying. And so if I don't demonstrate empathy, if I were coaching you and I don't demonstrate a genuine concern for you, and I don't demonstrate empathy for your situation, then you will likely begin to feel like you're attacked personally, at which point you will begin to feel the need to defend yourself, and you won't actually be able to hear what may be legitimate feedback and coaching. And so I'm not doing you any favors if that's the case. And so one of the things that we can do here in coaching conversations to build that empathy up is don't start the conversation by telling somebody what they're doing wrong, which is hard. I struggle with it too, because a lot of times coaches are good at seeing the gap and they want to point to the gap. But what we want to do is have a conversation. So say, if I know that they missed their number, I might not start with, you missed your number, you got to do better, which, by the way, is one way to do it, right? I might start with, how do you feel about your performance for the month? Because if this person missed their number, but they made great strides, they may feel like they're really getting somewhere. And I don't want to deflate that. I want that momentum and that energy to keep moving them and compelling them forward. So I would start with more questions than answers in order to demonstrate that I care, because that gives me a chance to listen and demonstrate my empathy.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it makes perfect sense. And so you demonstrate empathy by, well, you mentioned earlier, I don't think in this conversation, about the mindset
No,
that a person should bring into this conversation. And so how important is that mindset, and how does that translate into empathy or enthusiasm or sentiment, so on?
I think great coaches are very different than other people in terms of the starting point for them. So in order to be a good coach, I think you have to have this ability to balance results. You can't abandon results, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you balance it with a genuine concern for the people that produce the results. So a really good coach values the person that produces the result even more than the result, but still wants to see the result, right? And so it's an interesting balance. People who are all results oriented have trouble demonstrating they care about the people. And by the way, they have lots of conversations about numbers, but not as much about how they're produced or how it impacts and makes the people that produce them feel, right? Mm-hmm. Whereas people who are people lovers and people pleasers have lots of conversations about the people, and do they like what they're doing, and they feel good about it? And even are they developing their skills, but they don't tie it to results? And I think you have to have a mindset that balances the two. I remember when I went to work at Reflect, it was honestly, it was the nicest culture and the nicest people I'd ever been around, which was a challenge for me initially because I tended to be more hard driving. And I had to learn that you have to show how results are fun and getting results are rewarding, because there was no performance culture at some point. It was more, let's all help one another, right? And you got to balance that. So I think that the right mindset is essential. You have to love the people and you have to love producing results.
Right. So we have a question I think is relevant. I was going to hang on to it, but it's relevant at this point. So Bob, what if the mindset, how important is the mindset of the, for lack of a better term, coachee, the person being coached? And is that something that you should be, you're using mindset, the word mindful of? Is it maybe time to coach or not coach, depending on, let's say the mindset of the person is not in the mood. They're just not in the mood for it. They asked it a little differently, but that's the gist of the question.
Yeah, so two-part answer. First is whether or not they have coachability as a core talent or capacity, right? So coachability is something that can be sort of innate, especially when you get to people that are, adults. By now, my ability to accept feedback and accept coaching has a lot to do with how I got to where I am at this point and how secure I am as a human, right? And how self-aware I am. So if the issue is they don't accept coaching and feedback, then that's problematic in an environment where if they already have all the skills necessary in order to produce the result that they need to, then that's fine. You won't need to coach them. But that's not the case for most roles and most positions. So first thing is we encourage all of our clients to make sure that coachability is something they test for in their hiring process. Like when we hire people, we always tell them they did something wrong in the interview. Not because they failed the interview, but because it's important that they understand what it's like to get feedback that isn't positive and how they respond to it. And we want people that genuinely want to learn about what they can do better. And that's an important characteristic. There are times when somebody just isn't in the right mindset for coaching. We just had the example of somebody who missed a number, but they're in the right mindset because they made progress and they can feel it and you can build on that. Somebody who feels beaten down, it might not be the day to have the coaching conversation. It might be something that you want to schedule. There are also coaching conversations that have to happen in the moment, even if it isn't going to be comfortable. Because if they don't happen now, the scenario that requires coaching will be too far gone. It'll be a memory, and it won't be like if somebody really has a bad outcome. This is where you see some great NFL coaches doing it on the sidelines right after the play, and not just NFL coaches. You would see Nick Saban do it frequently. You see Kirby Smart do it frequently in college football, where when a player comes off the field, they are immediately having that conversation. In a lot of cases, by the way, the conversation still begins with, what were you thinking just now? What was going through your head? Because I want to fix that. Never mind what just happened, but I need you to know what you were thinking when this happened. So I think the time you don't do it is if it's not essential that you do it right now, and it's just a bad time for the person. And by the way, when you demonstrate that you don't have to have it right then, you are demonstrating empathy for them.
Yeah, right. An awareness of it's about them and not about you. But I think we could all think of exceptions to that when you have to give coaching in the moment. Or maybe it's more like feedback is important. Safety issues come to mind.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah.
Right. Is that like you don't want to let that moment pass. So to speak to coaching the coach. So the last two areas that we look at in terms of the conversation, and so again, we've taken this right out of TalkMeUp's AI-driven analysis, says that persuasiveness scored, a 90. So persuasiveness in this context means the logic of your coaching, the rationale, the the logos, the how
Yeah.
Fact-based was it? So in your opinion, how important is it for the coach to be able to substantiate their arguments with solid rationale, or not their arguments, but their feedback, not feedback. I keep making that mistake. Sorry.
That's all right.
They're coaching with logic and rationale and facts and stories and anecdotes, and just to make it more credible.
Yeah, I think it's essential. And each time we do that, we earn more credibility. It's like we get more chips, relational chips that we can then use when we need to help somebody make a change. And so it's important to be willing as a coach. And this is something we have to be willing to demonstrate. I love that you used stories there, for example, Andy, because it's not just making the logical case, but it's being able to make it relatable with our own experiences and being okay being vulnerable. So if as a coach, you feel like you need to present this persona that you've mastered it all and failed at nothing, then it will be very difficult to be as persuasive because, and by the way, there's a great book I'm reading on this now by Charles Duhigg called Super Communicators, about how we communicate in ways that are more persuasive, and being vulnerable and sharing experiences is a part of that. So if I were having a conversation with somebody who was struggling to achieve a target, I might want to share that I've been there. I've had that experience, and it was kind of a beating for me, right? So that they understand that I can relate to that, and that makes the argument more persuasive. We also have to have some logic to it. So this, by the way, is a challenge if the behavior that I expect, going down a level from the result, is different than the behavior the person thinks they should engage in. So it's important in a variety of jobs, not just in sales, but also in engineering. I've run engineering teams before, that we agree on what the work should look like, the behaviors that are important, right? So if I think an engineer should have clear requirements written, and the engineer thinks that all they need to do is write code, we don't agree on what the right behaviors are. Me telling them that they don't have the skill to write requirements and they need to develop that isn't going to resonate. And it isn't going to be persuasive. So I need to make sure that we're aligned on what the ideal behaviors are. And then when we talk about what the cause of a gap is, being able to describe the root cause clearly is really important. And it's one of the least developed skills in business, I think.
So in this context, then persuasiveness would support that argument directly.
Yeah.
Persuasiveness is your ability to cite data, tell stories, just substantiate the idea that you are providing coaching around. And so that's huge. Let's finish up this coach the coach discussion with sentiment. So sentiment in this definition is the coach's tone. How effective did they come across? Were they negative? Were they neutral? Or were they positive? And it reminds me, like 100 years ago, not that long ago, but some odd years ago, I was an assistant coach on my daughter's 6th grade basketball team. And the head coach was like a junior Bobby Knight type person.
Oh.
And so sometimes, but it's genuinely a good dude. But one of the parents came up after practice and said, hey, wasn't talking to me, but I was standing there next to it, said, hey, coach, I really think my daughter would react better to positive reinforcement. And his answer to that, as soon as she does something positive, I So maybe that's not coaching. I don't know what that was, but how important is the sentiment? Like, is it always important to come across positive? I mean, obviously, I think when I ask the question, it's not. But what's your opinion about the sentiment of the coach?
I think it's always important to be intentional, not always important to be positive. I think that when we do it badly, and I have done it horribly, by the way, when we do it badly, we are letting our emotions drive our sentiment and not focused on what is most useful and helpful for the person that we're providing feedback and coaching to, right? And so what you find is great coaches are very situational. right? And they're thoughtful, they're intentional about it. So if this person and this scenario requires that I express disappointment, I need to be able to do that, even if I'm not feeling it at the moment, right? Because maybe we just won the game. But what this person did was absolutely wrong. And they need to feel the discomfort of being wrong. But I don't feel bad because we won and I'm feeling really good right now. That's not the kind of conversation this person needs in order for them to feel what they need to feel so that later that will be in their mind. So I think that sentiment's important. I think that we also, when we're disappointed in somebody's results, like the example we've been using, somebody who feels like they made good progress doesn't need me to beat them down because I'm disappointed in their results. That's not the most effective sentiment for the conversation that we're in. So I should be thoughtful and intentional, and it should be outwardly focused on the person being coached, not on what I feel like I need to express. If I need to express something, I need to go get a coach and express it to my coach, not to the person I'm coaching.
I agree with you. It should be situational, and you have to use your judgment. I think the sentiment can be positive because the best coaches. Well, let me just make the statement and you can agree or disagree. I've always felt like the best coaching was about what should happen, not what already happened. Would you? And so
I think
in
that's
that context, it's somewhat positive in that we're not so much worried about what you did wrong as opposed to what you should do next time.
Yeah, I think that's fine, so long as the person who did it, there are situations where, and they're not every day. There are situations where something happens that's kind of egregious, and they need to have a recognition of what happened in order to see the difference between that and this. Otherwise, what can happen is they don't see that there's that big a gap. And sometimes there is an enormous disparity between what occurred and what needs to occur, and they need to feel the distance, right? So yes, we will ultimately, by the end, we will want the sentiment to shift to positive, but we may need it to be uncomfortable at the beginning so that they feel the weight of it. You said safety issues. You cannot underemphasize this. You know, Boeing's a big news story right now, and what did or didn't happen, we probably won't ever know for sure. But one thing we can be probably all agree on is when it comes to safety issues, if there's a gap, then it needs to be clear how important that is. Yeah. But I think you're right. By the end, you should be shifting to the future look, the forward look.
Yeah. So we're going to move ahead here in just a second, but we're wrapping up this. What makes it meaningful is empathy. It's listening. Mm-hmm. There is a sense of enthusiasm in terms of maybe it's not happy, but it's certainly, there's hopeful that it isn't going to stay the way it's always been. It's going to get better. There's the persuasiveness, which is the logic of your discussion. And of course, the sentiment is situational. So we know that in any great story, there's, just take it out of any context you want, there's always a hero that's trying to get something and maybe preventing them from getting that. Somebody comes alongside and helps them get what they want. So at the end, it has either a happy ending if it's a comedy, or if not, it's a tragedy. So if you, Bob, were going to write a story about meaningful coaching conversation, like the most meaningful of all time, who would be the hero of that story to you? And who would be the guy?
Like a real example of all time?
Well, just like conceptually, like just as a mindset perspective, are you swooping in to save your person by coaching them, or
no? So, and it's a term that might be overused and under demonstrated, but the most effective coaches are servants. The coach is never the hero of the story. It never makes the person being coached feel like they live in the coach's world. right? The best coach, honestly, one of the best coaching conversations of all time is actually a biblical story of Jesus talking to Peter when they're walking together along the beach, and Peter has failed miserably. And Jesus isn't trying to correct a behavior. He's trying to give a person back their sense of value. And he does that by sort of drawing parallel to the failure to this situation. But what he does is he focuses his energy and does what Peter needs done. And that's what the coach always does. The coach always is able, not, and none of us are perfect, right? But the coach is the one who is able to put what they need aside and do, and sometimes do what's even uncomfortable for them to help the person being coached get to another level. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it makes perfect sense. And I think it's a really, it's a great story. And it's also speaks to that mindset that on our best days, like it's not about us, it's about the person that we're coaching. We're not here to save them. We're not here to elevate ourselves. We are truly, I mean, if you think of like Star Wars is another good example.
Yeah.
Who's the hero of that story? Well, it's Luke Skywalker. He's the hero. Who's the guide? Yoda. He's all about coaching. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there you go. Right. Definitely not the star of the show. And the coach doesn't need to be. Right. But there are people who find themselves in roles where they are required to coach who also have a need to be the hero. And it really is it's a very difficult scenario.
Yeah. Well, let's move ahead because you've come up with a model for how to actually ensure that you are the guide. And appropriately enough, the acronym stands for guide. And so, I wanted to ask you.
That's convenient.
Well, how do the best coaches have meaningful coaching conversations? Well, they follow a framework that you've developed called guide, but I think it's probably evident to some. But maybe could you speak to like, how do you get that discussion started, and what does it look like when it's done well?
Yeah. So the G for goal setting is something that is done a little less frequently, but very intentionally. So being an effective coach, we said before, requires that you know and care about the other person. And goal setting is a great opportunity to do that many people miss. And the example, the analogy I'll use is if you hire a personal trainer or you hire a golf instructor, right? When you hire a personal trainer, you don't show up in that first meeting and the trainer says, my goal for you is that you run a 6-minute mile. That's not what happens, right? You're hiring them. So as managers who want to be coaches, it is important for us to understand that we are being hired by the people that we coach. And that means that we need to understand, what are those people trying to accomplish? In sales, it's really easy because we tend to give them a number and then tell them that's what we want. That's not the way the conversation, it should really be flipped on its head. It should be, what do you want? And why do you want it? What do you want to earn? What do you want to accomplish? What does success look like for you? So that's kind of the goal setting. And then a good coach, by the way, knows how to get them there, can create a plan with somebody that helps them achieve what they want to achieve. And you see that with golf instructors. You see it with tennis instructors. You see it with music instructors. You see it with personal planners. You see it with all of these people, right? Your personal trainers, they do this well. So that part typically happens a little less frequently. It happens quarterly, maybe, right? But this UIDE part happens on a regular basis, like normally a weekly or bi-weekly or monthly cadence, right? The first thing is uncovering the gaps, but that isn't me coming in and saying, here's what you're doing wrong. It is understanding, being aligned on what the performance targets are and what the behavior targets are, and starting the conversation with, how do you think you're doing? How do you think you did this last month or this last week? And do you see any gaps? Because if they recognize the gaps, that's an invitation, and people are more motivated by the things they want to get better at. They're going to be more invested in the coaching that comes with that. So I can ask them, what things would you like to improve? One of the ways we do that with salespeople is qualifying is about learning about an opportunity. So I'll ask somebody, hey, tell me what you know about the opportunity. And then I'll ask them, what do you think you're missing? Let them decide. What do you think you should get next? Identifying the root cause a lot of times requires us to engage in a conversation about why it happened. And even depending on what the skill is, actually watch them do it, right? So if it was a surgeon and there's a gap in their skills, we need to actually see how they, what the technique is that they're using for this particular part of the procedure, right? In order to understand whether there's a skill gap or a knowledge gap. And that requires some investment for both of us. So that's identifying the root cause. Then, and this is a challenging part, I need to know what to do to fix it. So if you're a tennis instructor or you're a golf instructor or you're a music teacher, you know what drills to give people. That's your job. It's harder in other jobs. There are some people that know really well, they can give somebody an exercise. Like even engineers, I've seen engineering leaders say, hey, I want you to write code for this week. Yes, I know that's not in the product, but I want you to practice this kind of thinking and this workflow this week, because it's going to help you when we get to writing the code for the next part of the project.
Right.
Makes sense? And then the E is important because really, when it says evaluate performance, I'm evaluating whether or not the coaching stuck, but not for the purposes of evaluating the person as much as evaluating my own coaching. Did that assignment produce the change in skill or knowledge necessary to affect the behavior going forward? And if it did, awesome. And by the way, coaches celebrate progress, not the result. So you heard Nick Saban talk about this all the time, always talking about the process. As a coach, if I gave somebody a drill to do, I'm celebrating that they did the drill, whether or not they got a better result, right? It's doing the drill. I want to reward the commitment to continuous improvement.
Right.
And that, by the way, Matt Wilpers is talking to me every time I ride that bike about how he really, values that I'm making the effort. And that's what we want to reward. Does that make sense?
Well, it makes perfect sense. And I think about Carol Dweck's book, the growth mindset. And if you want to create a growth mindset among your team, that this desire to get better, this coachability, that the way you evaluate performance it's such a huge impact on that. If you just evaluate the results,
yes,
you are undermining someone's desire to learn, aren't you?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and we don't get into the habit of learning and improving if we beat people up all along the way. The habits we want people to engage in are habits we need to recognize and reward. And so learning something, doing something that helps somebody get better, even if it doesn't produce the improvement in skill, we want to reward that they did it because that's the habit that's necessary.
All right. So we're going to move into the round of this. It's the rapid fire. What if?
Oh, great. So I got quick answers. I got to go quick with my answers.
Quick answers here, just like what top of your head. What if? So the first what if would be there's a disagreement on the gap between the performance and the expected results. Well, you think, well, how could that be? But it's happened. Like, I think I did it. You think I didn't. What if?
Yeah. I think the first thing is this is a time where what you mentioned earlier, focus on the future state, is absolutely essential. If there is a misunderstanding about what the goal was, you can't go back in time and change it. And a genuine misunderstanding, right? So I think one thing to that growth mindset is people who are good coaches respect and value others and don't assume that they have ulterior motives. In fact, they don't worry about whether or not they have ulterior motives. So if my expectation was that somebody would do this and their expectation was success was this, we need to talk about why the gap exists, not how they're wrong. Because it ain't going to help any, right? But we do need to help figure that out. We've had that in our own business at Axiom, where we didn't define the goal clearly enough. And so what somebody thought was 100% achievement was really 70%. I'm not going to beat them up because we didn't figure out together what it is. We just now recognize that going forward, we need to make that more clear.
Right. And again, the mindset would be about, to simplify, well, let's identify why we had the gap, but that's not nearly as important as what we both should agree on in the future.
Yes. And what will we do differently so that we don't have this kind of gap in understanding going forward?
All right. So our second what if for you in this rapid fire round is what if someone has the skills, the knowledge, and the capacity, and they're still not delivering the results?
So based on the pyramid, there's only one thing that you haven't mentioned there, which is a commitment to the results.
Well, I guess that's true. So can you coach to want to or commit?
Yeah, and I think it's important to understand. And by the way, great coaches, Pat Riley comes to mind. The coach of San Antonio, who I can't think of his name all of a sudden, but it comes to mind. Great coaches understand that motivation and commitment aren't always flat. It ebbs and flows, right? And so if someone has the skill, knowledge, capacity, but isn't committed at this point, I need to really take the time to understand why. They might have something going on in their lives. And it's just a stage that they're in, a phase that will pass. And the best thing I can do is demonstrate empathy and help them by caring about the fact that they're in that phase, not trying to beat them out of that particular phase, right? If someone has the skill, commitment, capacity, and knowledge, if they have all of them and the result's not there, then there is another variable that affects results, and that is the environment. So it may be that it's characteristic of the market or some competitive pressure, or it could be some other external factor. And I really, as a leader, I need to understand what those external factors are. What I don't want to do is focus that person's attention on the external factors. But when we say they have the skill, it doesn't mean they can't get better at the skill and they can't become more knowledgeable. And it may be that the environment that they're in requires another level of skill development.
Yeah. Okay. Well, and I think that was a really respectful way to answer that. Sometimes if they don't care, maybe it's
sometimes they don't belong there. Yeah.
Maybe that's not coaching. So I think not every situation can get better because of coaching if there's not a commitment, but I love the way you answered that. All right. This is a two-parter on the what if round. So and this is softball right here. You ready?
I'm gonna crush this, by the way.
You're gonna just
yeah. So you better move the outfield back.
What if someone got really good at this? What if they got really good at having meaningful coaching conversations? And I guess the other hand, what if they don't?
Well, this is an easy one for me because I have been a good coach, but I've also been a horrible coach. So, and I'll start with the what if you don't first, right? So, my bad coaching experiences had some very uncomfortable consequences. The first one is results don't get better, right? If everybody always has all the skill and knowledge necessary and the capacity and commitment to do the job, you don't need a coach anyway. They'll win. So that's rare. But when I wasn't good at coaching conversations, and it wasn't so much a state or a phase, because it is situational. I have been bad at coaching conversations as recently as this month. So, right, there's always opportunity to improve. When you're not good at it, what happens is you don't get the results that you could get. You don't enable the people on the team to be as good as they can be. The second thing is you have fractured relationships. You create challenges that are hard to overcome when you don't do it well, right? And it feels crappy. So, so as much as a coach might be a person who wants and needs recognition from others, you're not going to get it by doing it badly. The people that work for you, the people who you are coaching, for whom you serve as the coach, they're not going to give you positive feedback if you're a horrible coach. So you're not going to have a lot of fulfillment if that's what you need, and it ain't going to feel good, right? So the opposite is true when you do it well. So when you do it well, I think for me, the most valuable thing is you build relationships that last a lifetime.
Yeah.
So, we worked together many years ago, and I've unfortunately had to let go of lots of people in my career, many of whom weren't being let go because of anything they had done. And because we had built strong relationships through our time together, we're still friends and we still value each other's opinions. I called you for coaching on a presentation just this week. So, right, that's the kind of thing that you get. It's also extraordinarily rewarding. And again, I'm going to quote Matt Wilpers, because when people tell him about the milestones they achieve, that is winning for a coach.
Yeah.
And so what's nice about being a coach is when you do it well, you're winning over and over and over again. Every time somebody completes an assignment, every time they achieve a new level of performance, or they acquire a new skill, or they leverage knowledge they didn't have before, and you help them get there, you win. So you win a lot when you're a good coach, and it's a lot of fun.
Oh, I love that. All right, so let's kind of wrap up. We are getting towards the end, Bob. So I really want to thank you. So let's move ahead and
My pleasure.
Formally thank you very much, Bob Cole. Will you please advance us one slide? Bob is the CEO of a fabulous company called Axiom Sales Kinetics. And so you can email him at any point in time, and I'm sure he'll be very, very happy to hear from you. But
Absolutely.
Here's your chance to make a plug. So tell us about Axiom's vision, mission, and the unique value.
Okay. So I don't often do that. I do it all the time, actually. So really our purpose as a business is to elevate the sales profession. And by elevate, I probably need to define that, because people tend to think that just means better results. And it does, but better not just in higher numbers, but the sales results that we produce should be more predictable, more consistent, and better. And in many cases, people don't recognize that it's not just about crushing it. Although crushing it is good, it's also about being able to produce consistently and being able to produce in a predictable fashion so that the rest of the business can be run more effectively as well. And sales gets respected. It's also, we view it as though we are elevating the profession, but it's not just for the profession. So we really believe that buyers are underserved when salespeople are pitching their products, because the problem for most buyers isn't that they don't know what the solution does. The problem with most buyers is they don't know how to decide which is best. And so we're elevating the profession really by transforming the conversation between buyer and seller, and in many cases between the coach and the player, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what makes us different is really two things. One is we have a methodology that we've built over some 30 years that enables salespeople to be real trusted advisors to everyone they meet, which means for a salesperson, every conversation is rewarding, because every time you meet with somebody, you're helping them make a better decision. That means stronger relationships, the kind of things we talked about here. It means happier customers when they buy. It means in many cases referrals, even if they don't, because when they don't buy, it's because it's not the right thing, and you both know it.
Yeah.
So it's a much more rewarding experience. So the methodology is unique. It's very comprehensive. It applies to a wide range of sales scenarios. But the other thing that's unique is we don't do traditional sales training events. We do this by a guided learning platform that allows people to get better on a consistent basis, like every single week, but at a pace that works for them, where they have some agency over their learning journey. And you don't pay hundreds of thousands of dollars to train a team up front. You pay based on them actually using it and making progress. So that's really what differentiates us.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And so thank you. And we appreciate that. So if
Oh,
any
my
of you
pleasure.
that joined us today have a need to create this growth mindset in your sales team, and this coaching culture, and this like learning while performing and actually getting better to serve buyers and each other, then I would recommend strongly that you reach out to Bob and just begin that conversation. And his email is right there. So thank you guys, everyone. Finally, for joining us today. As we move to the wrap up here, you'll receive a complimentary 1-month subscription to Try TalkMeUp, so you can record yourself as a coach. You can record a conversation like this, and get some feedback, but make those conversations really persuasive and meaningful for both in the way that Bob described. You can see our blog. In fact, Bob wrote an article about this very topic for us, and you can get that on our blog. The URL is listed there. And we'd ask you also to follow us on LinkedIn. That's how you'll find out about next month's webinar and other things that are happening. We try to provide a lot of leadership around conversation. Persuasive communications is what we're all about, and how to use AI to get better at it. So again, thank you very much, Bob. Thanks everyone else for joining us. Thank you to our moderator, Cole. There's a lot more people. Greg Popovich, by the way, is the coach in San Antonio.
Greg Popovich. Yes, thank you for that.
To my mind. So anyway, that'll do it for this month's webinar. Thanks for joining, and we'll talk to you guys next month.
Thanks, Andy.
All right. Take care.